Hey, all you wiretappers out there, I'm back here in studio of Gangland Wire having a little fun, and you might recognize that face with my good friend Camillus Robinson. Welcome, Cam. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, Gary, means everything to me to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so we were just talking recently. I got hold of Cam. I said, we haven't done anything lately, and so we were kind of batting ideas back and forth. He had the idea about really when the mob started going downhill. A lot of guys I see on Facebook and all this, oh, John Gotti did that. John Gotti ruined the mob. He's the one that's responsible for the end of the mob, which is not really ended, but it took a big hit back in, particularly in the middle to later 70s. It started. And I'll tell you right now, guys, it wasn't John Gotti. There was a lot of other things going on. John Gotti didn't have anything to do with the commission case. He just had to do with Gotti cases and the Gambino family. What really started it was the FBI and Robert Blakely's law that he wrote and got passed in the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. And we know it as RICO, or Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization. Now, that's a mouthful, isn't it? RICO. That's why we say RICO. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about it, and then Cam and I will get into the kind of the history of the FBI using it on the mob. Under RICO, if a person has committed at least 2 acts of racketeering, and then they have like 27 different crimes, and then 8 as federal crimes and 8 state crimes. And if they do that within a 10-year period, they can be charged with racketeering if these acts are related in a specified way to an enterprise. Now, the enterprise, of course, is the Gambino family, or the Kansas City family, the Chicago outfit. And then they get storytellers to say, this is part of the Kansas City Mafia. This is part of the New York Mafia and the Gambino family. Or, these people are all part of the Chicago outfit, and name people off. And they always have to have that storyteller because they got to create that enterprise. And that's a good way to do it. And they have really draconian sentences. Fines are one thing, but nobody cares about the fines. But 20 years in prison for each racketeering count. And I tell you what, you get into like mailing out 500 false insurance claims. That's 500 counts. Each one is a racketeering count. And when they get done, they have to forfeit any ill-gotten gains or any interest in any business that they've gained through this pattern of racketeering activity. They can also issue a restraining order. The U.S. attorney can ask and get a restraining order or an injunction to temporarily seize a defendant's assets to prevent them from transferring any potentially forfeitable property, and or ask them to put up a performance bond. So back early in these days, I know in the RICO case here in Kansas City with the skimming from Las Vegas, they didn't even try to go after anything. Early in this, the government wasn't really geared up to go after seized assets. But they got into it big time. It was a Joe Massino ended up forfeiting like $12 million in different companies and gold bars and cash and other assets. It's just crazy. So, Cam, we're going to talk first about one of the earliest, I think is the earliest RICO case, but it's the earliest one I can find is 1974. Now, this thing had just passed in, I don't remember, 1970. 70. I said that earlier. So 4 years later, it took them a while to get on and figure out how to use this and use it in connection with informants and wiretaps and hidden microphones and business, white collar crime investigations. So they had to get it together. And one of the first ones was this Dominic Broolier. Is that Broolier? Is that how you pronounce that, Cam, you think?
Broolier. I've always said Broolier, the head of the LA family.
Broolier, okay. And he was the head of the family. They went out and started him in 1974 on a RICO case, which he pled guilty to real quickly. And racketeering and extortion, he pled out in 1975, just a year later. But 3 years after that, in 1978, they hit him again under RICO for racketeering, extortion, and murder this time. They also got him, and you'll recognize this name, Louis Tom Dragna.
And Mike Rizzatello.
And Michael, Rizzatello. Samuel Sorrentino, which I'd not heard of. I'd heard of
Mm-mm.
Rizzatello, and I never heard of this Jack Lo Cicero. So I'm not sure they were. They convicted them of it. Now, the murder in this, remember what the murder was? The murder charge in this, Cam, was the
I'm trying
bump.
to think that
Yeah,
it was the bump.
the
Yeah.
bump. Yeah. And see, that was Jimmy Fratianno had been, they tried to pull him into that, and he backed off from it because he knew he didn't really want to have part in killing the bump, but he knew that they did it. And him coming in then gave him a good storyteller on that. So
yeah, Frank Bump and Sarah. What I think a lot of, to contextualize what you're talking about, Gary, this period in '74 when Broolier was being tried is when they brought Fratianno in as the acting boss. So that was where he had all those connections. So he was the best connected, and they stepped him up and said, "You be acting boss." And it was kind of like you take the heat for whatever's going on right now. And they didn't think it was going to take a long time. And the paranoia of the mob came in, and they eventually went after him. But it was during that time, and that was really a hell of a domino push, because that was when you had Fratianno flying all over the country, trying to make moves, dealing with mobsters in other countries, I'm sorry, in other states, and really getting as tied in and as juiced in as possible as a national figure. And that would later come back to bite everybody. So that RICO kind of lit the match that would eventually lead to the downfall of many families.
You know, kind of an interesting thing is why the bump got on the outs out there. They didn't really realize he was an informant until this happened. And he had persuaded Broolier to try to do some extortion on a porn company. It's called 4X. Well, 4X, the porn company, was actually a huge, big one of the early FBI stings. And it's a big sting that they had in the porn business in LA. And so when they discovered this was an FBI front, you know, they figured the bomb is the one that steered us toward this. And he did steer him toward this. And he was an informant at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Frank Bumpensere was a hell of a, he's not somebody that outside of mob circles is as well known, but he is somebody who everybody in the mob knew. Frank Bumpensere. He had ties in St. Louis and Buffalo and New York and Chicago and Detroit, and just all around the country. Bumpensere was a nationally recognized old world type mob figure. And so they said there were certain cities he would not inform on, and they didn't know if that was because he didn't trust the FBI in those cities. But he was really one of the first major made members to step forward and become an informant in that LA family, whatever prestige they didn't really have to begin with. Bump and Sarah really knocked him down. In order to get close to him, they made him the consigliere to sort of relax him because he was so cagey. It took him 2 years to kill him.
Yeah.
And Vitello slipped that on.
Did they consider him kind of like the boss in a way? Not really the boss, but in the San Diego section of the LA family, because he lived down in San Diego. I always thought of him as kind of like the boss of San Diego. He was the top dog, I believe, for the mob in San Diego. Is that right?
Right. He was a capo for the LA family, and he wouldn't leave San Diego. That was where he wanted to live. And so he started as a capo in order to relax him because he didn't trust anybody. It's almost, you hear a lot of these mob guys trying to do hits and get too close to somebody. And Bompensero, nobody could get close to him. He was too cagey, kind of like in what you had in Philadelphia with the Salvi Testa. It took them a long time to get through his guard to kill him. And somebody called him on a telephone. Yeah. It's Fratianno is very sparse on details in his book about the murder of Frank Bompensero. Mike Rizzatello set up the murder, and they shot him on the street corner with one of those stolen 22s from, I've done some extended research on, but that was a 22 caliber killing. And Bompensero, then the FBI later went to Fratianno and said, "We've had Bompensero. We can get, will you work with us also?" And by the time this first RICO case you're talking about, he pled guilty and sort of pled out after 2 years, and they didn't know how stringent it could be. So he didn't face major consequences. Yeah. And they started going after Fratianno to murder him. They thought he had gotten a little bit too big for his britches. And that was when Fratianno began informing. And the information he used would later reconstruct RICO cases all over the country.
Yeah, that's kind of another advantage of that RICO is you can make informants out of people when they're looking
Mhm.
at life in prison for some of their just normal day to day activities that they used to get. Maybe get 5 years, eight, maybe even 10, 10 years on, but now they're looking at, multiple counts and they're looking at 40 and 50 years. It's a life sentence really for if you're halfway old at all. So it's
I,
a pretty
some of the
powerful tool.
some of the younger listeners might not pick up on what the name Rico, where it actually comes from. It's from the Edward G. Robinson and Little Caesar. I think it
Ah,
was Little Caesar, and he was his character was Rico. I can't remember the last name, but he was a gangster. Edward G. Robinson, I'm going to rub you out, Shaggy. And so Blakey later denied it, said it had nothing to do with this early mob movie and this character named Rico, and that was where he got the name from it. But really, he it would basically be like he put it together racketeering, and so it stood out and said RICO. And anybody in the know back in the 70s would have understood this was an early gangster movie, like The Godfather or similar, about a
yeah.
real mob figure. And so that was the genesis of the name of the RICO Act, was some G. Robinson's character RICO.
They probably played around with words until they came up with that, or somebody looked at that and said, "What acronym would be RICO?" And then somebody else said, "Oh yeah, RICO, that's a good one. Let's use that."
That'll stick it to. That's right.
Somebody, Robert Blakely had a sense of humor, or one of his people did.
Yeah, really sticking a thumb in the eye of the mob there with that like.
Yeah. And it took a while for him to get on to using this, but boy, once they got started, I saw another looking at some old RICO cases just to see where all they'd used it. And there was something called the Cowboy Mafia was one of the early RICO cases in 1978, which is, you might imagine, a bunch of drug dealers down in Texas. And they used it on the Hells Angels. That's where they got first big case on the Hells Angels as an organization in 1979 was a RICO case. They actually had brought Sonny, what's his last name?
Sonny Bulger. No,
Not Bulger.
that's Whitey Bulger. It's Sonny. I think it's with a B.
Yes, begins with the B, guys. You know who he is. Whitey, though.
Too many mob
Not
names.
Whitey,
They're all
Sonny.
running together.
Really.
They're all running together. Barger, Sonny Barger.
Sonny Barger. Sonny Barger, they put him on the stand and asked him if he'd ever informed anybody. And he had informed, but it was against like the Black Panthers and people like that out in LA. And so he had to kind of embarrass him. I put a little story up about that, and I got all kinds of kickback from Hells Angels lovers. Sonny Barger was never an informant. He was a man's man. So actually, I didn't put him on the stand. They put a police sergeant, Oakland police sergeant, on the stand, and he's the one that testified that Sonny had given them information on the Black Panthers and people like that. Anyhow, that was in their Hells Angels RICO trial.
Right. That RICO trial. And I think, Gary, you and I talked about this, and you were present. Blakey used to go around and give talks to law enforcement. And you sat in on some of those talks back in the 70s.
I
They came to Kansas City.
I sat through one of those, and I tell you what, I walked out there like, I don't know what he's talking about. It sounds good to me, but it's so complicated. That's why it took a while for the lawyers to get into it and figure out exactly how to use it and to not lose cases, not put a bunch of resources into something, and then have it overturned on appeal. So it was complicated when it got started.
Yeah, but I think it was Giuliani who really added it to his toolbox and understood what the full potential of it was. Yes, he was one of the first who thought we can really use this.
And now they're using it
he
against
understood
him.
It.
He's a defendant in a state RICO case, and most states have a state RICO case. I don't think we do in Missouri, but most states model their criminal code modeled a section to have a RICO charge in each state. Another early one, 1980, Frank Thierry is a Genovese boss. Said he was
Funzy Thierry.
Yeah. Funzy, is it Funzy?
Funzy, yeah.
Yeah. He was supposedly the first boss of a family, the head of an organized crime family, the Genovese family, to be convicted under RICO.
And a lot of that goes back to Fratianno, yeah.
But
Fratianno was a major. No, go ahead there. I'm sorry. I'm so excited.
And I guess we did say that Brooklier was the head of the LA family when he was convicted. So Thierry must have been the second one, or the first New York head of a family that got convicted. But interesting thing about him is, and I just kind of got into this, and I didn't really think about it before recently, is he was more, and Genovese was family is well known for this. Chicago's well known for it, and that's having an out front boss who is, a street boss, if you will, a guy to whom most people think, oh, that's the boss. But he wasn't actually the boss, just like Fat Tony Salerno. Everybody thought he was a Genovese boss, and they're pretty well convinced of it. And while the Chin Gigante is wandering around his bathrobe pretending like he's nuts, and he can't run his own life, let alone a whole crime family. But yet he was, just like Ricardo was behind the Cana. So Thierry was really, Funzi was the out front boss behind this. Benny Squint, Philip Lombardo, I believe was his
Lombardo, name. Yeah. I think a lot of the times these guys who we now know as the behind the scenes bosses don't get the credit they deserve for I mean, they were real hard mobsters. They were sort of put in that position. They had earned respect, but they certainly weren't going to be the boss. And Funzi Thierry, if you look at like Joe Cantalupo, who you're familiar with, he was an informant during the 70s who actually wore a wire against the person who found that he owned a flea market that kicked up to Funzi Thierry. And Thierry was a powerful guy. And when Fratianno came to New York to meet with the Genovese, he sat down with Funzi Thierry. That was one of the people who he sat down with. And he gained information about, and just talking about, hey, we're co-mob bosses together. And one of the things they talked about was, we have to get rid of Joe Bonanno, and why are you guys letting him operate out there? And it was really a enlightening conversation, and read that in the last Mafioso, this conversation that took place between Fratianno and Funzi Thierry. Now, Thierry did not like Joe Bonanno, none of them did, but some of the information that Fratianno provided, he did testify in that trial. That Thierry, I don't know, he actually testified, but they used his information to cover that trial as a when he witnessed directly, but his information was key in Funzi Thierry's trial. So I think that what we see more and more in the mob from the 70s to the 80s, what we're talking about today, is how these little ticks, how law enforcement started planting seeds that eventually did yield results in the early 80s. In the 70s is when they generated things, and then it was in the early 80s that everything sort of went to hell for the mob leadership.
Really, and speaking of Funzi Thierry and his RICO case, one of the more important facets of that was the assassination of Angelo Bruno. He got involved in that. That was a deal. I mean, I think back to that time, we know pretty well. It's pretty well known that Chicago and the Eastern families got together, and I think they got together in Philadelphia and agreed that East Coast would have Atlantic City when it fired up, and Chicago would pretty well have exclusive rights to Las Vegas. So now Atlantic City's, it belongs to Philadelphia, and historically it's so close, geographically it's so close that they just feel like that's part of Philadelphia. That is the Philly family owns Atlantic City, and there was too much money down there. The New York families had to have part of that, didn't they?
Yeah. And what you see there's the machinations, the high level machinations between the Gambinos and the Genovese. The Gambinos had Angelo Bruno, and Angelo Bruno was Carlo Gambino's guy, and then he worked with Paul Castellano, and he was a sitting boss on the commission, so he couldn't be murdered. So Funzi Thierry plants this seed about, well, you do what you got to do to these guys who wanted to whack Angelo Bruno. And later on, when I can't remember the name of the drug dealer guy who was involved, but he came up to when the Philadelphia murderers and boss Angelo Bruno went back up to Funzi Thierry. He said, I never told you to kill anybody. I just said, do what you got to do. And then the Genovese family, under the direction of Thierry and Benny, by that time, Benny Scrooge might have been out of commission, but certainly under Chin Gigante, they murdered these Philadelphia guys who could have potentially been witnesses against them in a commission investigation.
Yeah, that was Antonio Caponegro.
Caponegro, yeah.
Yeah, he was actually the consigliere that
Yeah,
that
the drug dealer.
Tierra told him. He said, hey, we'll support you. And the commission really wants to get rid of this guy because he's not letting us in to Atlantic City. And then, like you say, he goes. They summon him to come back, if I remember right, for a meeting with the commission. And
Yeah.
next thing you know, they find his body, which is really interesting. The way they find his body. These guys like to send messages with bodies. I know we had a guy here that had his pockets cut, which supposedly is he's been stealing. This guy had $20 bills stuck in his butt and in his mouth. So that's I mean. That's old school. That's old school mob.
Later determinations were that the guy just didn't carry a wallet, and that's where he kept his money. So just spell those rumors, Jerry.
I don't know. I like the rumor. I like the story. By 1983, that's when we had the RICO indictment here in Kansas City. They had all these trials down here in Kansas City of Joey Doves, Iupa up in Chicago, and Jackie the Lackey Cerrone, Angelo La Pietra, Cork Savella. Nick Savella, our boss, died by the time the trial actually got started. He would have been charged, and our underboss, Carl Tuffy DeLuna, Frank Ballesteri, and both of his sons, Joseph and John Ballesteri of Milwaukee, and Milton Rockman of Cleveland. So that was with the skimming, and they had, kind of remember how that went down. They had all these wiretaps. You had informants who weren't going to testify, and you had a lot of surveillance. And then finally, after they ran the wiretaps as long as they could, then they did search warrants and got only evidence they could out of it. But then out of that, they turned one of the main guys out in Las Vegas, a guy named Joe Augusto, who was really into the Tropicana. He worked in the Tropicana, but he also knew a lot about the skim coming out of the Stardust and Lefty Rosenthal. And Lefty was feeding them information about it too. But he never had to testify. But Augusto, he started testifying and naming names for the first trial. And then he died. But because of that, there was another guy named Carl Thomas who was involved heavily at the Stardust and was really closer with Chicago, and he turned. And so he brought down the rest of them, everybody in Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland. So it was, it was one hell of a prosecution. This was, ranks right up there with the commission. If you think of more like the Midwest Commission trial, if you will, to break down those mob bosses of four families, that was unbelievable.
Yeah, that was it. They ended within months of each other, the commission trial and the mob skin trial. You had all the Midwest bosses and you had all the New York bosses doing that at the same time. There's an interesting story, another example of 81 being a bad year for the mob. It had to do with the laborers union, Laborers International Union of America. And Robert Joseph Hauser was a corrupt insurance. I mean, his insurance schemes, we should really look into doing a show on this guy, Gary. He was probably the most corrupt union insurance agent of all time, imaginable. And when he was caught, he implicated Raymond Patriarca, Santo Trafficante in Florida, and Tony Accardo in Chicago. And there was a massive laborers trial that was set to take place in Florida. It eventually fell apart because Hauser was such a liar and he had been investigated. But he said that he was part of a scheme to set up to steal and to misappropriate and embezzle funds out of the laborers. And of course, the laborers union was one of the big four main corrupt unions. Mm-hmm. But that trial involved those three mob bosses, Santo Trafficante, Raymond Patriarca, three guys you don't always necessarily think of in the same breath. But it does go to show that there were much more before the 80s, before the mid 80s when things fell apart. Those ties between mobsters were much more distinct and defined than they are, certainly than what they are now, or that they were in the 90s. But that was a major trial. Shortly thereafter, I think Patriarca died in 84. Well, he was facing a trial also. I don't remember that it was RICO. I need to double check, but I know that the laborers trial was going to be a RICO trial, and it collapsed. but it was a major trial the mob was facing. They did have to go against it. You had Marcello down in New Orleans was facing his own issues with corruption and rigging political office and different things. So it was really, if you look at the spots on the map of these, whether it's LA, like you said, or the Midwest, Kansas City, and Chicago, and Wisconsin, you look at Florida, Rhode Island, just New York, New Jersey, all over the map. You've got these trials springing up, and some of them are involving RICO, and some of them they just don't have the know-how to implement it yet. So it's really the mob leadership for the first time between the mid 70s and the mid 80s is really being targeted and brought down in a way that the lower echelons. That's why there was so much violence in the 70s and the 80s, I think, because with the leadership distracted by law enforcement, it was just open season on the streets.
Yeah. I mean, that's the tool to go after leadership, because all they do is say, hey, do this or do that. It may even just do a nod of the head. And then you got to have some storytellers in there to then explain what this meant. But, then the wiretaps or the bugs. I tell you what, I listened to a hidden microphone with Tuffy and Nick Savella talking for hours about just different things. I mean, Tuffy was the underboss supposedly, but he was also like the consigliere. Nick would run things by him. Do you think I should call Lefty directly, or do I have to go to Chicago? They bat that stuff back and forth, and all that on the wiretaps, and the hidden microphone says this is an organization and this is how it's organized, because that's what you got to show. It's an organization. This is how it's organized, and that's how you get to Nick Savella, who maybe never. He finally did get him meeting on a hidden microphone with one of the guys who was on the ground in Las Vegas skimming when he came back here. Actually, two of them, that Carl Thomas and Joe Augusto. But it's really hard to get a microphone or an informant or anything in those places, because these guys, they just send work out through one of their underlings and they take care of it. So that's one reason that RICO was so powerful, just like Giuliani getting, the heads of the 5 families. Can you believe that? Jesus.
Yeah, that was as the Netflix documentary shows, and as you and I have been following up for a long time. I mean, the extent to which they determined we are going after these guys. We are going after Restella. We are going after Castellano and the Gambinos, and they were going to go after everybody, Salerno, the Genovese, because they knew, law enforcement knew about Gigante, but it was an easier target to go after Salerno with all the weapons. And the Tony Ducks and the Lucchese family, to tie all those together in that way. And I remember when I was doing the Inside the Outfit, I looked at the calendar in the 80s, and it really was, I want to say, one trial ended in September, and the other one started in February, and the other one in September. So there was just a matter of months with the leadership between the commission and the Midwest bosses. I mean, it really, that was all over the course of basically 6 months that they were completely decimated with that RICO Act.
Yeah. Then they just started picking off the underlings after that. It seemed to get easier and easier after that. They got Joe Messino finally, and it was kind of like the last domino to fall there in New York City.
It's the last big fish.
That's probably another reason all those guys were turning, as Salvatale and all them later on, because they saw what was happening. They saw the handwriting on the wall. Hey, the government's serious, and they've got a powerful tool. And they're going to put me away for the rest of my life. I mean, I'm done the rest of my natural life. This isn't, and I didn't murder anybody directly, but they were going to get it anyhow.
It wasn't so bad to go to, what was the big mob row? It was up in Philadelphia. It wasn't Lewiston. The prison where they all ended up going.
Lewisburg. They all went to Lewisburg. Yeah, at a mob row up there.
You would go to prison for a couple of years, do your time.
Yeah.
But more importantly than that, you would make national connections in prison. Yeah. And you know that, Gary. You go to prison as a car thief, and you come out as a cocaine smuggler. I mean, you make those connections. You learn about other guys. So that when you get out, you've built up these relationships that go on. And it used to be prison was a necessary part of being a mobster because that's where you would make national connections that you wouldn't make not on the street. Once the RICO Act came about and those prison sentences became 20 years in a supermax, that was not time that these old men wanted to face. And not time that anybody wanted to face. But you've got some guy 40 or 50 at the top of his earning potential, and he's got a nice big house in Saddle River, New Jersey, and he's he's driving his Cadillac around, and you say, okay, you are going to a supermax out in Colorado for street crime, basically. I mean, that's nothing. That's what this guy grew up on. He's not doing that. He's not doing that at 50 with his high blood pressure and all. So he becomes an informant, and these guys were beating each other. They were just beating each other down with a stick to be the next informant. I mean, there was the lineup of the Bonanos, and every guy in the upper echelon of the Bonanos became an informant, including the boss of the family. I mean, it was anymore. It's just there's nothing there. You're just gonna go and you're being part of your trajectory as a mobster. As you become a mobster, you get made die, and then you go to the FBI and become an informant. Yeah, that seems to be the case now because this RICO has everybody so nutted up.
Wish they could figure out how to do that with some of these street criminals here in Kansas City.
Yeah.
Chicago.
Yeah.
Man, that would help a lot. But all these guys been looking at draconian sentences for having crack cocaine for years now. It doesn't seem to dissuade them. The heavy prison sentences doesn't seem to dissuade the modern day street criminal.
And they're still in the Castellano-Racy era of their crime, where they just murders on the streets and dying. So the idea that you're going to get a 20-year prison sentence just doesn't exist when you expect to die the next day anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and Castellano, I mean, those guys, they lived good. They lived really good. They had a lot to lose. If they went down for a long time, they had a lot to lose. Wasn't like, a street kid that has nothing to lose. They had a lot to lose. Plus, they had families.
I got a modest house. Got my family. I've got, my car and just my regular life. And I don't want to go down for 20 years and get it all up. Hell, I'd become an informant too. I couldn't imagine if I was living in a mansion or something with the whole family. I'm not the tough like that.
I wouldn't be either. I'm not either. And it's so hard on their kids too, for these guys. They all have kids, and it's just really hard on these kids. If you ever talk to these mobsters' kids, and you've talked to Lisa Swan, who was married to the mob, and just see what a toll that they have to pay to be part of that life, just so the man can go out and be a gangster, be a big deal gangster when he's on the streets. And it's just really hard to believe. I know this friend of mine who came out and got reformed. I know his son pretty well. And his son said, and he told his dad once, as Steve told me, that his son told him, he said, Dad, when you were up there, I used to go visit you up at Leavenworth until you went farther away. And he said, I would cry all the way home because I just wanted to bring you back with me. I mean, I talked to a guy's daughter, and, she said almost exactly the same thing. It's just, it's just devastating to these families to go away for that kind of time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. And I think that it goes to the sort of the sociopathic nature. A lot of these guys, that they don't think about the family. They think about the money they're providing, and even then, and when it comes to doing business, just the very oath that this thing comes before family, when we buy into it.
Yeah. And you think of any other good RICO cases? I'm trying to think what else they've used that on. What did they use on the pizza connection? I'm sure that was a RICO case.
Yeah, I think the pizza was.
And a bunch of banana cases in that, banana people.
And that was when Tomasino Vercetta came across. So that really, just the use of the RICO there dominoed into the Maxi trial over in Italy. In its own way. I mean, these tentacles is an apt. It was a decision is apropos because they are tentacles spread out. And as the pizza trial came down, I can't swear to it being a RICO, but it would have been, the timing would have been about right. And then that connection and the Italian mobster eventually informing led to the Maxi trial, but basically the Sicilian a long time.
An interesting little story about that. There's a guy named Gaetano Badalamenti that was one of the big wigs in that Tomasino really buried, and he ends up in American prison system, for the rest of his life. He was old when he went in, and I know a guy. He showed me a picture of him, and he said, "You know who this is?" I said, "That's Gaetano Badalamenti." He said, "Yeah." He's got his arm around him like he's buddies, And I said, "How in the hell did you get to know him as a Kansas City guy?" He said, "Well, I got a call." He said, "He's come to the prison where I'm at." I think it was a Springfield, or it was the one, I think it was the one up at Rochester. It's like a medical facility up there too. And he said, "I got a call or a message from another Kansas City mob guy that he's coming in here, and when he gets here, I need to take care of him and show him around. He doesn't speak English very well, and get him lined out with his commissary, and show him the ropes when he gets there." So that's I tell you, the mob is connected. It's good to be part of a deal like that. If you're going into prison, like you're talking about Mafia Row at Lewisburg, and so it kind of takes some of the sting out of going to prison.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got people looking after you years after you've been an old Italian man. And that's something to get your commissary right for you. That's
all right. So I don't know. I think I pretty well covered this, the early days of RICO and how effective it is and how it works, and different places that they've used RICO, and the U.S. attorneys used RICO. I tell you what, these U.S. attorneys, the people that go into that, don't go into it for the money for a long time, but they are some of the smartest tools in the toolbox out of law school. You don't just, it's not like going to being a public defender or even a local assistant prosecutor. They have a really intensive selection process, and you have to be one sharp cookie to get that job.
And those guys are they are vicious and single-minded and focused, and they really, I wouldn't want them after me.
I would not want them.
No.
A couple of them have been friends of mine, but I would not want them after me. They were smart and unrelenting. I'm telling you.
Oh, yeah.
Now, one guy, David Helfrey, he was prosecuted the skim case. He right here in Kansas City, he prosecuted all that. Of course, they wanted it in in Las Vegas, and they wanted it in Chicago, but they were onto it, and so they all got prosecuted here. And he retired from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he's been in private practice for white collar crime kind of things ever since. He still does a little bit. He actually moved to Las Vegas, the last I heard.
Those guys are sharks that come after you.
Yeah. So if I ever have a white collar crime federal case, I'll have to hire Helfrey.
you know who to call.
I know who to call. If it's a local case, I'll call John O'Connor. If it's a national federal case, I'll call Helfrey.
Helfrey, yeah. Somebody want to get those numbers for me after we go up there. In case.
Oh, if you go down, I'll probably hear about it. I'll go visit you and get
record about it.
Yeah, I did one podcast. I did one in the prison up at Cameron here about a guy that went down for 14 bank robberies out of St. Louis. So he was up here at Cameron in the prison. I got his girlfriend. Somehow she had contacted me about she's trying to write a book about him, and so I ended up going up to Cameron and interviewing him up there.
Yeah, it's your special. Podcast, dude.
This poor guy, he robbed 14 banks in the St. Louis area. He got convicted. He copped a plea in the federal system and got 8 years, I think, because this was his first go around. He was like a stockbroker that was just having money trouble and decided this would be a way he could supplement his old higher income. And it was always a threat of a weapon. He didn't ever have a weapon, always use a threat of a weapon, but it's basically the same thing. And the state prosecutor in St. Louis County, there was about 8 of them, actually. Of the 14, he was about 8 of them that were actually in his county. The other 4 or 5, 6 were outside that county. So you can do this in Missouri. It's one of the few states you can do it. He charged him in St. Louis County and convicted him and got him 25 years. So about 10 years, or 12 years after he would have got out of his federal system, he's still doing time now. He's just about to get out finally, I think. Crazy, huh?
It says a lot of time.
That is a lot
14
of
banks is a
time.
lot of banks, though.
He didn't make any money.
No.
Most of these guys will
It
tell you,
wasn't.
I made about 10 cents an hour for my crime.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. I mean, unless you're a stockbroker, you're not making much
All
money.
right, Cam, I really appreciate you coming on and helping me with this, and we'll have to do something more in the future.
Absolutely, brother. I had a great time. I'll
You
be in
know,
touch soon.
something I'm thinking is interesting is Bill Bonanno in Arizona. There's some meat on that bone, isn't there? The Bonanos
I
out in
think
Arizona.
so. Is I've got the book that Bonanno's wife Rosalie, his wife wrote. And speaking of what we were saying before about families, that was one of the models for the book that I wrote. I read her book, and let me pick over that a little bit. She didn't know much, but I did a good long article about the Bonanno War, and I know that as we during this RICO stuff, Joe Bonanno went down during this period, and Bill Bonanno was obviously his first lieutenant, and they were doing stolen cars and a bunch of stuff. So let's do some digging. We'll check into it. I
Okay.
think that's worth.
All right.
I think it's worth a look.
All right, Cam. It sounds good. All right, guys. I like to ride motorcycles, so watch out for motorcycles when you're out there. And if you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website. And hand in hand with PTSD is problems with drugs and alcohol. Now, they'll help you at the VA with that. But if you're not a veteran, go see Angelo Ruggiano down in Florida. He has a treatment center. He works in a treatment center down there. And I think he has a hotline on his YouTube page, I believe. And if you want to learn more about the Gangland Wire podcast or about me and the Mafia in general, my Gangland Wire podcast Facebook group has like 17,000 people on it. No, wait a minute. That's a YouTube page. It's got like 50 or 60,000 people on the group, the Facebook group. And there's a lot of good discussions, a lot of good pictures on that. And,
oh yeah.
And we have a lot of good comments on my YouTube channel too. I put each one of these podcasts out on YouTube as well as on the audio. There's a lot of great interaction in the channel, the comments underneath the YouTube. So check those out, like and subscribe, whether you're on both of them, on the audio app and on the YouTube channel. Give me a review if you think about it. And Cam has a book. It's called
Chicago Swan Song, a mob wife's story. It's a lot of good attention. It's a great book. Lisa Swan, who was married to Frank Calabrese Jr., she went through it all. They were short on details in the home place, but she sat down to Thanksgiving dinner with Frank Calabrese Sr. and Nick Calabrese, two of the heaviest hitters and biggest murderers in the Chicago outfit. She sat down to dinner with them, had Christmas morning with them, and lived to tell about it. It's a great story about a strong woman protected her family through the ups and downs of mob life. It's a great angle. And take a look. We appreciate it. We'd love to get your feedback on Amazon, or you can always reach me through Gary's page here on Facebook myself. Let me read it, and I'll definitely interact with you. If you want to send me a copy, I'll sign it for you. I'll always interact with everybody. Anything that I've done out here has been through the help I've always gotten for everybody watching me on podcasts. So thank you very much.
All right, great, Cam. That they all lived in like a compound, like a 3-story house in Chicago, didn't they? The whole extended family.
They had one of those 3 flats for a while. Lisa and Frank sort of had their own place, but where they lived was owned by Peter DeFranco, No-Nose's brother. And that caused some hot water with the fire. I mean, the places that they moved and the mob bosses and people that they had to rent, that they rented apartments from throughout this. I mean, it's like I said, DeFranco was one of their landlords, and Frank Calabrese Sr. was a landlord, and the Calabrese growing up lived in a 3-flat, which is a Chicago term for a three-story apartment where there's one apartment on each floor. So it was really, he lived in a giant Tony Soprano type house. He just lived the Tony Soprano life, like Calabrese Sr. would say. It's really a good model of meeting and talking to people at all levels of the mafia on what it's like.
Did everybody have to come over for Sunday dinner with?
Oh yeah, that Sunday dinner was a big deal. A big deal, and everybody was there, and everybody was laughing and smiling on the face of things, and terrified and resenting one another on the lower levels. And I guess that's just like any family Sunday dinner, but There was a lot of there
Different
were a
level.
lot of mixed feelings. Exactly. Yeah, there weren't any guns on the table, but it was definitely she found herself in some very potentially dangerous predicaments dealing with this mob hitman who did not like her.
They used to show that on The Sopranos. They'd even have,
Yes.
some of these guys would come over for Sunday dinner with the family. I remember thinking, that's probably ripped from real life, and I think it
Oh
is.
yeah. I think so.
Wow,
I think so.
I can't even imagine what that life would be like. All right, well, get that book, guys. You're going to find out the inside story about what that life's like. If you ever wondered what it was like to actually live in a mob family, and it ain't fun. I'm sure of that. Thanks a lot, Cam. I really appreciate you coming on the show.